Hello, Christopher.
Well, good evening, Ron, ladies and gentlemen out there in the wide audience. Thanks for coming aboard one more time for Monday Night Monsters, and welcome back.
Yeah, I could not wait. Our episode last week was so enthralling, and that was probably the best numbers we've ever had for any episode. So I really want to thank our audience here. They're great.
I want to thank everybody too. Yeah, that so far our Samhain Origins episode has by far about almost 2 times as many viewers as any other episode we've ever done, and that's after only a week. Where some of our episodes have been up now for for months, and are still not even anywhere close. So obviously that was well, hello there, Facebook user. Not sure who that is back there, but thanks for coming aboard. Yeah, obviously that was a subject that people were fascinated by. Hey, Mary Beth, good to have you back, of course. I'm sorry that your daughter's cat got out. Hope that hope you can find the cat. I'm a cat person myself. By the way, folks, we want to let you know that that Ken, who's usually our guy in the chair back there, is not going to be with us for most of the show this evening. So we're going to be doing our normal kind of stumble through. And so if we miss your comments, we do apologize. But of course, when you post them, we always check them out later and do try to follow up with those. But as you, I'm sure, all realize this evening, we're going to be dealing with kind of almost a follow up in some ways to last week's episode, because it is the season of ghosts. It is October here, and we are entering the Samhain season, of course. So we're doing an episode on the origin and the history behind the that spookiest of creature, the reason that Halloween exists, ghosts. And so we're really looking forward to this evening.
Absolutely. And from what Ken had said, our fearless leader, who it's not going to be the same not having him here, but there's a rumor out there on the streets that you and I are actually renewed for next year already.
Oh, all right. Well, hopefully they'll get those contracts out to us and give us that big pay raise we've been looking for. So.
Absolutely. And we will begin that to show our worth tonight with our episode on ghosts.
Very good. So yeah, let's just get things started, because as you know, shocking no one here, we've got a lot of slides to get through, a lot of info to get through this evening. And so let's just get started and talk a little bit about the fact that of course, again, Halloween wouldn't be what it is without ghosts. Ghosts are the reason for the season here. And, I think that ghost stories in a lot of ways are one of the most fundamental human types of storytelling, because it's about the unknown. It's about that last great frontier that nobody really has ever come back from to explore, and that is what exists on the other side of on the other side of life, on the other side of the afterlife. And right. So I would say that ghost stories, certainly told around the firelight, have been a part of human history since really the beginning of history, certainly before even recorded history.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you 100%. And the other thing I was saying before the show started, I just did a talk at Gettysburg over the weekend, and ghost stories also put things in a historical context as well, too. It also really shows that the lives that went before us had some sort of meaning to them. And I think that that's very important, because there's a legacy there as well, because, they represent bookmarks into a particular time and place. And by looking into that world, we can see, ourselves, basically. We learn something from those.
Absolutely, and I think that that's very much what ghost stories are. It's a way that we come to understand that our ancestry, our past, and our background still has meaning for us. And in a lot of ways, I think what a ghost is at its most fundamental level is a kind of a memory that sort of intrudes upon waking life. And you were just asking right before we got started here whether I'd ever been to Gettysburg, and unfortunately, I have not. But that's something I'd like to rectify. I have an ancestor who was wounded at Gettysburg. His name was David McClure. He was a sharpshooter there, and I've always wanted to go down there and learn a little bit more about Gettysburg, about the history of the battles there. Of course, obviously Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and just for the context of the history alone, it is supposed to be one of the most haunted battlefields in the world.
That's what they claim. That's right. But the people were going there not so much to look at the headstones. It was for the ghost tours. And there were so many ghost tours there that people were literally tripping over themselves. And I think the reason why people do this is because there's something quite different about hearing a ghost story over somebody talking or pontificating about, dates and figures and stuff. A ghost story, ironically, brings history to life in a way that a regular tale cannot do.
And it brings in the emotion, it brings
It
in sort of
does.
humanity. I think that I was not a fan of history when I was in school, not at all, and largely because that was, you usually taught a procession of numbers. You had to, what year was the Gettysburg Address signed? In what town did this politician or this battle take place? And it didn't have any context. It didn't feel human. But as we were saying, the humanization of these ghost stories usually involve tragedy. They involve loss and so many things, and so it really makes it feel more real, and it brings us home. I think that touching us with that emotion is what makes us connect to it, and then the history starts to stick.
I'm excited to get rolling.
So let's see. Somebody just popped a comment up that I want to take a quick peek at again. I'm sorry. So let's see here. As I say, without Canaditis here. All right. So some people say that ghosts are history that refuses to be forgotten. Sarah, I love that. That is a wonderful quote. I've heard that before, and I think that it is absolutely true. And that's very much, I think, what we're getting at there is that it's a history that touches us. It's a history that actually means something to us, and so should certainly not be forgotten. And maybe in many ways that is what ghosts are. And that was our first big question for the evening, in fact, is what in fact are ghosts? And that's a question that ultimately we continue to struggle to answer. But just for the sake of context, let's come up with what the Oxford, or actually I believe the Cambridge Dictionary says about what a ghost is. So it's a fairly basic description: the spirit of a dead person, sometimes represented as a pale, almost transparent image of that person that some believe can appear to the living. So that's a pretty bare bones, and pardon the pun, explanation, but that gives us the framework that we need to build on to try to figure out this evening what ghosts are and what their contexts are as our history goes forward.
Yeah, for the purpose of this podcast, I think that that's a pretty good one.
Now, the truth is that I would think that anybody who's listening to this program is fascinated by ghost stories and by stories of the supernatural and monsters, but that doesn't mean that we don't all still find these kind of things a little bit on the frightening side. And that has a great deal to do with what is significant about ghosts, and certainly how they relate to this season, the Halloween season, because our fear of the dead does stretch back to humankind's very beginnings. And that's, I think, how ghost stories came to be. I think that there is a point in history where we began as a people, as a species, to realize that a dead body wasn't simply a dead body, that there was something potentially more going on there, and gave rise to, I guess, what would be the earliest of ghost stories. And it was actually one of your suggestions before we put the show together tonight, to talk a little bit about early burial practices, human burial practices. And I found some interesting information from about roughly 11,000 years ago, at a place called Great Horn, where the deceased were arranged in a grave with great care, bodies placed closely together and aligned to face the direction of the setting sun. And with them were laid an array of offerings, both artistic and mundane. Again, we talk sometimes about the way the Egyptians and other cultures, the Celts, placed objects in the grave that were potentially useful, so that the spirit, when it crossed into whatever new world they were going to, would actually have the things that they need, but also items of tribute and things like that. And this already shows us that people, even in those very, very primitive times, obviously believed that the spirit, or that some part of a deceased loved one, would continue to live after death.
Right. I think that if we look at least from the archaeological record, we can find that there is some semblance of the burial of the dead even before we were anatomically human. Probably Neanderthals started it somewhere, slightly before 200,000 years. And very poignant if you look at these as well, too, because sometimes it's simply an arrangement of flowers with a dead person, but it's still the understanding that this was somebody that they cared about in life. And they hoped that after this body was interred within the earth, that somehow that person would go on in some form.
Absolutely, and so there is a great deal of the traditions of burial, traditions associated with the afterlife, that have to do with lost love, a person that we valued going on, the fact that we feel a sense of loss and a sense of grief about them, and want them to be okay wherever they're going. Which is why certainly the Egyptians were expert at that. Cultures like ancient Egypt placed great importance on the afterlife of souls and where they would go in the land of the dead. And the Egyptians had a particular word which is fascinating, because their idea of what a soul was, they referred to it as the ka. And the Ka, which means essentially double or spirit double, they believed would actually travel back and forth to the land of the dead. By night, it could actually travel through the land of the dead, but they believed that by day, it would actually come back and reside in the mummy, in the mummified corpse within its tomb. And so it's interesting to think that they believed that it was a regular process for that spirit to travel back and forth between the land of the living and the dead.
Yeah, I think that when we get to the idea of the afterlife of the Egyptians, it's very confusing, isn't it? Because not only do they have this Ka spirit, this kind of enlivening spirit of the human body, they also have that spirit that actually does move on into the afterlife as well. So it kind of resides on two different planes at the same time. But again, without the Egyptians, even though we do a lot in the Western tradition, without the Egyptians solidifying the idea of what death is, we really wouldn't have the ghost stories that we have today.
Yeah, I think they had one of the most complicated and sort of codified cosmologies of what ghosts were and what ghosts did. And maybe I would say it certainly didn't invent the idea of appeasing the dead, but they certainly perfected it. I mean, if any spirit was going to go into the afterlife, happily set up for the new existence, it would have been an Egyptian spirit because of the way they prepared for it. Even common people who did not get pyramids and enormous tombs of their own still went into the afterlife with great care, wrapped for burial with all their precious things, and occasionally with a few mummified pets along for the ride, like a cat, which I would love my cats to come with me into the afterlife as well. So
yeah, well, which is interesting because it's relatively recently that we've come to terms with the idea of animal spirits, but in the Egyptian life, that was part of their ideas, their belief systems, that all of creation, not only the human beings, but all of creation was endowed with this particular spirit that could go beyond this particular plane of being.
well, and I mean, the Egyptians held on to an idea pretty late in sort of world history, later than a lot of cultures, where their gods were often portrayed with an animalistic aspect. Bast as a cat god, or Anubis, as a jackal, Horus as a falcon, and things like that. And so, animal gods were something that by that point most other cultures had moved away from, and their gods had been humanized. But the Egyptian gods had this anthropomorphic form of both animal and man, and that's really interesting to see that they had this sacredness that they associated with animals so late in world history.
Absolutely.
And what I think, in a way, I mean, it's very akin to a lot of pagan religions, with the polytheistic or multi-god way, but it's a very magical and very mystical kind of. We talked a lot about this in our Mummies episode, which we did during our first run. But if anybody ever wants to go back and watch that, I think we had a lot of fun with that episode. But
Absolutely.
But yeah, such a complex cosmology and a very, very complex idea of what happened after death. Now, it's probably comparatively late in human history that we came up with the idea of collecting the dead in very specific locations for burial, in what we now call cemeteries, which are what you might call a necropolis. It's a city of the dead. And to this day, I think that graveyards certainly remain one of the most iconically frightening places in folklore and legend. I mean, every single Halloween decoration, or Halloween movie is going to have zombies coming out of the graves and ghosts running around in graveyards, and somebody wandering through the graveyard and whistling past it to avoid ghosts and things like that. And it really is a terrifying place, because I think in our hearts we understand that when you walk through a graveyard, as beautiful as they are, as wonderful as the history is, it's fascinating to read the stones, but you're walking over the bodies of the dead, and that's got to be a little bit disconcerting, which I imagine does not hurt in fostering the kind of ghost stories and the way people become very susceptible to them when they're walking in an old graveyard like that.
Right. And of course, this does have a heritage within the historical record as well, too, because we can see that the Egyptians buried their dead out in the desert, right, in the West. And those places were to be feared as well, too. That was the place of contagion. That was the place where demons resided, for lack of a better term. And if you look at the Sumerian record, the idea of the burying places, the desert areas, that's a place where Lilith would reside, or the jinns would reside, because that's far removed from who we are. That is a liminal zone where the living should not trespass. That's their own abode over there. And absolutely, that carries on even to this day. And I remember as a kid walking through a graveyard, and I was told, never step on the bodies because you have to show some sort of respect. And that continues with us to this day.
One thing I think actually a lot of people don't realize, and that this is true in almost all cemeteries, and it's more obvious in older ones, is that when you are facing, if you're standing before a gravestone and reading the inscription on the grave, the body is not on the side of the stone with the inscription. The body is on the other side. The body actually faces away from the inscription. And in most old grave yards, they would have both a headstone and a footstone. So it worked like the headboard on a bed with the inscription facing out in either direction. This way you could come to visit a loved one. You could place flowers on the grave, sit with them, speak with them, but not have to defile in any way the grave by actually standing on it. I think that every time you watch a monster movie and the undead are crawling out of the grave, they're always coming up in front of the print on the grave, because that's kind of the way we imagine it in our heads, but it's actually exactly the opposite, so that you would not need to do that.
That's right. And Pepper Jackie actually brought up a good point as well, too. There is a difference between a graveyard and a cemetery. A graveyard is attached to a church, and a cemetery is something out all by its lonesome, out in the middle of nowhere or up on a hill someplace.
You're 100% correct on that, Pepper. And I'm not going to lie to you that in my general vocabulary, I switch churchyard, graveyard, cemetery, and all these different things. I switch them back and forth all the time, and I should be a little more precise about that, but I'm usually not, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. Sarah says inscriptions are for the living. Well, that's very, very true. Obviously, it's about memorializing the dead, and it's so we can go to a graveyard and find some comfort. Reading, sort of remembering a person who's passed beyond. Their poems usually that honor them in some way or some part of their life. And so very much graveyards themselves, these places of burial are for the living, so that we have a place to go and visit our loved ones. But it's interesting, because so far almost everything we've spoken about has been about our sort of grief over the loss of a loved one, and the fact that we miss them and we want them to be able to go and visit them. And that's interesting, because it still remains true that the idea of ghosts, which are often the ghosts that we would encounter, might be ghosts of loved ones. And so why do we find ghosts so frightening? It's because you shouldn't think that if your great aunt Gertrude returned to say hello to you, you would think that that would be a lovely thing. But one of the questions that I think that we came to have at some sort of indeterminate point in history is, could the dead return? And if so, might they feel angry or even forgotten or abandoned in some way because they were dead and we moved on without them? And there was some sort of lingering fear that we, in getting on with our lives, whether it was a person who lost a spouse and remarried, or a person who, goes on after a person has passed away to go and find some measure of happiness and laugh and sort of walk in the sun again, that the dead might somehow be jealous of that. And that was a frightening idea to a lot, and honestly still is to some people today, which I think begs the idea that if a ghost returns, is it going to be friendly, or is it going to be something a little bit more loathsome? And so that's an idea that still plagues us to this day, and again is very much the reason why holidays and celebrations like Samhain and Halloween, the Day of the Dead in Mexico, the Festival of Hungry Ghosts in Japan, all these things we talk about, the reason why these things exist. Here I go again with my excellent button pushing skills. Let me get this off the screen.
No, that was actually quite good.
Throw Great Aunt Gertrude up there for you just to get a little frame of reference. So.
I'm glad for the jump scare, but the idea though that you're bringing up is actually very poignant, because if you would look at the Roman traditions, about the time the Romans come around, that they start talking about haunted places. So one of the first places we see the idea of a haunted house is actually within the Roman theater, and if it would make it to the stage, then obviously it's part of the cultural consciousness at that time, because it wouldn't make any sense. So probably several hundred years to maybe even as much as 1,000 years before Jesus, we start understanding that people can think that certain places are haunted.
Absolutely. And the other thing about this is that, I've got another slide I want to bring up here, is that not only do certain places become haunted, but the appearance of ghosts, especially back in those early days, were often seen as there for a very specific purpose. They could be messengers, they could be omens of some kind. So in all of the old literature, in the ancient plays that were written in the Roman era, and even really carrying it right up into the 1600s when you have Shakespeare, ghosts usually weren't simply haunting for the sake of haunting. They almost always had some dire portent that they needed to communicate. And so this is something that became a huge part of ghost lore, is that ghosts usually were an omen of some kind. And that certainly would make them disconcerting, because if you see a ghost, even if it doesn't speak to you, it's the idea that somehow it is indicative that some terrible event is going to occur, some misfortune, some kind of a curse. And so that would certainly increase the fright factor of seeing any kind of an apparition. So just seeing them alone was considered sometimes to be a curse in and of itself.
Absolutely. And we know with Hamlet, because that's a good point to bring up Shakespeare, the reason why Hamlet's father returned is because there was some sort of injustice that was done, and it had to be brought to light in this world. And then whenever we think about Banquo and over in Macbeth, that is the constant reminder of the sins that Macbeth had committed against his friend. So they work very differently, but also in the same way as well. It's that constant reminder that there is something left to be said. The deed is not completely done yet.
In a literate sense, ghosts often represent the conscience,
Yes.
because in many of the old plays, and even to some degree in Shakespeare, the ghosts are always right on, speaking about being liminal, they're always right on that area, on that edge between, is it something that's really happening, or is it that character's conscience coming back to haunt them? And so being haunted by your conscience as a form of ghosts, both metaphorically and literally, is something that you see that happens all throughout folklore, and certainly all throughout literature.
Right. That's an excellent point, because I think that we forgot the idea about a person being haunted, which is something that you could actually, that's part of our literary tradition, of course, but the idea that a ghost could just torment one person, that hauntingness of the consciousness, is something that's overlooked as well too. It's not quite as woo as a haunted house, but it's also probably a lot more terrible to be haunted and tormented personally by a ghost.
And the thing with the haunted house is that if the house is haunted, you can simply leave the house or stay away from
Absolutely.
it.
Yep.
If you are haunted yourself personally, if you have a spirit that's following you for some reason or another, you can't get away from that.
That's
And
right.
that's certainly a very terrifying idea, to know that this ghost, this conscience, this dark memory can find you anywhere you are, when you think that your life is going well, and suddenly remind you of some dark aspect of your past that you've tried to bury.
Absolutely. You can even think of it in the Telltale Heart. Now, we don't see a ghost within Poe's short story, but we hear that haunting heartbeat, which is still part of the human being as well, too, coming from the other side to remind him that there was a crime committed that was not brought to justice.
And I love that, I have to say, as a fan of ghost fiction, as a fan of ghost stories, and certainly of Edgar Allan Poe, I love the idea when they play with the difference between madness and the actual supernatural, and especially when they leave you wondering, where it's up to the reader to decide, was the person hallucinating? Was the unnamed narrator of the Telltale Heart, was he hallucinating the heartbeat of the old man, or did the old man's ghost simply drive him to madness and get him to reveal himself to the place, which of course is a wonderful device. And Poe was a master. In fact, I believe yesterday, was it just yesterday or maybe the day before, was Poe's birthday. So happy birthday out there, Mr. Poe. You've given us a lifetime of wonderful macabre literature.
Absolutely.
So the idea of frightful ghosts is certainly something that has become, honestly, ghosts are almost always portrayed as frightful. They're much more often seen as something horrifying than they're seeing something good. And so that certainly, once again, leads into why the current season exists. And it was probably the origin. And we talked a little bit about this last week too, but I think it's worth revisiting, is the tradition of trick or treat, which largely came about as a way, again, to protect yourself against ghosts. And so the tradition of having people dressed in dire or sort of horrific costumes, portraying themselves as ghosts and goblins and fairies and things like that, showing up at your doorstep. And the only way to drive away something which is a dark or evil force is through the force of good, the force of kindness. And so the tradition of doing things like giving out candy or food, or even offering these little goblins hospitality, basically defanged them. It stripped them of their power to do wickedness, and so that's one of the reasons why the trick or treat exists. And woe to anybody who actually turned away these goblins at the door, because by turning them away, your act of wickedness actually comes back to haunt you. And an ignored or unsated spirit could bring misfortune such as failed crops, disease, and curses. Hence the trick. And so the tradition of trick or treat still echoes that to this day. Although I would say that if I had to choose between having my crops fail and having toilet paper in my trees, I'll take the toilet paper any day.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Although those kids nowadays, they don't even say trick or treat; they knock at your door and just simply expect the candy.
Well, that's the sort of thing, culturally speaking, that eventually we got to kind of get ourselves back to it. I think that
I think so.
even kids sometimes, they're not well trained by their parents, which is
Right.
unfortunate. I think that to be able to really truly enjoy All Hallows Eve and the Halloween spirit, that you really have to get into it. You can't be embarrassed to say trick or treat. You got to scream it with all your might as soon as they swing open that door. So
Exactly,
and hopefully,
exactly.
and hopefully get full size candy bars, not those little snack size things which are going
That's
too
right.
fast.
As Sarah says, it's legal extortion.
Yeah, it is extortion, but it's the extortion of the very best kind.
That's
So.
right.
So what in fact do you do if you end up with a frightful ghost that is haunting your neighborhood, or is wandering about and causing trouble? And this is something that did plague our ancestors, because the fear of ghosts escaping the grave and causing mayhem became a very real concern. So this is how the concept of modern burials basically began. And now we looked earlier at the idea of very, very prehistoric burials, with people buried with all their goods and belongings, and we saw some images earlier of just traditional gravestones. But somewhere in the middle of all of that became the tradition of actually trying to keep the dead in their graves. And one of the earliest ways to do that was to pile stones upon the grave. These burial cairns certainly had the advantage of keeping grave robbers at bay, but the actual reason that they started doing this was in the fear that the dead might potentially return. And depending on the culture that you were in, the century, there were a lot of different ways that they did this. Piling stones on top of the graves was certainly one of the more common ways to do it, but they also even attempted to sometimes play tricks on the dead. And you could play a trick on the dead, for instance, by in Germany, where there was a spirit which is very much like a vampire called a Nachzehrer, or the night chewer, and it was believed that when it awoke in its grave, that it would chew its way to the surface and then go out and cause mayhem. And so they would just spin a corpse and place it face down, apparently believing that the corpse couldn't tell whether it was right side up or upside down, and believing that the Nachzehrer, the night chewer, would simply chew its way down into the earth further, rather than come up and and bother you up above. So these traditions are fascinating to me, because there were so many ways that they would attempt to keep the dead in their graves. Inscribing poems and inscriptions on a gravestone didn't begin as just a way to memorialize the dead, but a way to also sort of lull them to sleep with kind words, or even spells and incantations, symbols of rest and things like that. But some of them were a little bit more sinister, might not be the right word, but a little bit more direct. And I think that I've always found it fascinating, especially when you walk in graveyards that date back to the 15 or 1600s, to see how many skull and bone images you have on these graves. And this is because death symbolism, especially the idea of the skull and crossbones, which had become a universal symbol of death, was a way to actually inflict, to magically sort of enforce death on the soul, so that that soul couldn't just get back up and wander around as a revenant, sort of a resurrected ghost, which is a fairly pernicious form of ghost, but actually be forced to stay in their grave. And this magical tradition is something that we still again see in some way. We've kind of changed it over, so now it's always flowers or lovely symbols, but the idea of it still using its magical or sort of symbolic force to enforce death or rest upon the creature. R.I.P. Rest in peace. Let's be honest. Why wouldn't the dead rest in peace? The only reason to put that on the stone isn't to keep the corpse, from getting up under ordinary circumstances. But if the corpse is restless, it's to keep it down.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as somebody that was a cradle Catholic, somebody that was raised Catholic and still practicing Catholic to this day, you also have to look at things such as last rites as a remnant of that time, whenever you are trying to, at the very last minute, at least in my opinion, is trying to appease the soul of that person to go on to the other side. And people to this day will cover up mirrors so the soul of that person doesn't escape into the mirror and stay earthbound, or open up a window so the soul can't exit the house. 2023, people are still doing this.
Again, these traditions, they become like sort of baked into us, and I think it's a curious thing. I was also raised Catholic. I haven't been Catholic in a very long time, but it's very difficult when these things are hardwired into you as a child to ever completely escape them. Even if your spiritual opinions or you just mature out of certain ideas, it's very difficult to completely escape them. And it's one of the reasons why, listen, you and I, are both adults, we're both mature, we've got, lives and responsibilities, and you'd think that all that superstition would be long gone. But I can tell you one thing, and I bet this is true of anybody else listening as well. If I walk down into my old basement at night, when I turn around and I walk back up those stairs, I move fast because I'm sure that something is following me up those stairs. It's just the nature of fear, the nature of superstition that gets impressed upon us when we're kids. My dad used to tell me ghost stories as a kid, and I love them, but they still scared the bejesus out of me. And that lingers, and that kind of thing really stays. I believe that there's a reason why ghost stories have so much effect on us, and it's because fear is one of the most primal emotions, and it's one of the ones that we haven't bred out of ourselves. Almost every other emotion has been kind of flatlined by modern convenience. Having being able to get on the phone and get a pizza delivered. You don't have to worry about going out and hunting for food. If you're cold, you turn up the heat. So all those kind of fears and anxieties that we normally have from day to day are mostly flatlined because we have this wonderful modern world. But boy, somehow fear that just gets right through to the amygdala, to that sort of core of our animal brain that teaches us our fight or flight response. And so I believe that it's one of the reasons why we still are so fascinated by ghosts to this day.
Well, I have a washer and dryer down in my basement. My house is old. Part of the house was built in the mid 1800s, and I have this rickety staircase that goes down to the basement, and I have a basement song that I sing even to this day whenever I go down there, hoping that somehow that cheerfulness will drive any kind of ghost away.
It's a great idea, but see, that's what we need. We have these little rituals for all those reasons, and I think we all do them. And I think that that's it's a wonderful thing. I think it's one of the things that does kind of set us apart and make us very special. I mean, the human gift is imagination. Every species, every creature on Earth has some kind of an innate gift or power that it has, and if there is one that humans have, it's this amazing imagination, which allows us to see things that aren't there. And in seeing things that aren't there, it kind of expands our consciousness, expands our horizons. And so these little rituals help us tap into that sort of magical imagination. I think that's a wonderful thing.
Absolutely.
And speaking of, in human history, a particular period in time where that sort of imagination really took root and ran wild was in the mid 19th century. In the mid 19th century, the flourishing of Gothic fiction kind of brought the supernatural, back into focus again. In a time when we had largely put away those what we kind of thought of as childish things like ghost stories and witches and vampires and monsters, but 19th century Gothic fiction started to bring those things back into vogue. And as that happened, the Victorian, era people became more and more fascinated with the supernatural, with death, and became a very sort of death-obsessed culture. And that would give birth to something which becomes very important to where we are right now in this modern sort of ghost-obsessed age. And that is the age of late 1800s Victorian spiritualism. Where all of a sudden, what just a couple centuries before would have been seen as witchcraft and potentially illegal and even subject to prosecution, suddenly became parlor game vogue. And I think that's absolutely amazing. The idea, these folks were holding seances and using spirit boards and table tipping and everything else, and doing everything that would have gotten burned 200 years earlier.
Yeah, not only that, but the spiritualist movement also had churches, where you would have sing hymns and and all this other stuff, and then the ministers of the services would either channel a spirit or conduct some sort of seance to get messages from the other side. So absolutely, like you said, 200 years ago, these people would be swinging from a tree.
And not only that, but even you see that reflected. And again, I apologize. I hope this is not offensive to anybody, but you see that kind of thing happening in sort of modern, ecstatic churches to this day, with things like speaking in tongues and things like that, where they are, again, allegedly communicating with some kind of an external spiritual force, which is communicating messages that are apparently only understandable by the certain few. But it's exactly the same thing, where it's this ecstatic belief in the supernatural that is and existing in such a modern context, and to me that is fascinating.
Right,
But
and that's a
the
good
churches of spiritualism certainly. It's a shame in some ways that they don't still exist to this day, at least in the form that they did back then. But yeah, you see echoes of that even in these modern ecstatic beliefs.
Right. And, even though that I'm still a believer and a practitioner of the faith, I am still very, you have to look at this from a worldview, right? So I understand that the things that we talk about, like communion with the saints, something that's part of our belief system within the Catholic faith, is also communication with the dead as well, that people don't like to talk about.
Well, that's of course the concept of All Hallows Eve, from
Right.
which the
Sure.
word
Sure.
Halloween comes from. Was there, two concurrent Christian feast days? All Hallows was when you were venerating the saints, and of course the saints are all passed beyond. And then the All Souls Day, which would follow on November 2nd, was when you would just venerate the beloved dead. And so again, this was about going to cemeteries, visiting the dead, speaking with them, and so it is communication with the dead in a little bit of a more sort of innocuous form than maybe the old witches were accused of, but the concept was basically the same. So even within the Christian calendar, which I think to some degree was probably influenced by the Roman traditions we were talking about last week, like Feralia and Parentalia, but you still had these holidays specifically designed to venerate the dead. And it's funny because I think that a lot of modern Christians forget that was the point of what this period was, is the veneration of the dead. Still a very big part of Christian tradition, especially more magically or mystical Christian traditions like Catholicism, which is very, very heavy on ritual.
Right. And, we have taken the magic out of religions, almost all religions. But I think that if you would insert that back in there, that kind of wonderment, that kind of wide eyed, look at the world, I think more people will be coming to religion than leaving it.
Well, Protestant religion was a big part of that. Protestant Christianity was a lot about stripping away what they saw as the sort of superstition and the set dressing, which they believed was idolatrous and and even sometimes akin to witchcraft itself. And there is still some of that tension between the different Christian sects to this day. But even Protestantism has its sort of mystical elements to it. But I think you're 100% right. I think that people, if they're going to have faith, there needs to be a sense of wonder in it, and without wonder, what's the point of faith? I think looking out in the world and seeing the wonder that's out there. I think that's probably one of the reasons why why some of the more traditional modern religions are losing followers, is because they're stripping all of the wonder and all of the mysticism and all the magic out of it, and people have a hard time believing when there's nothing mystical or magical to believe in.
Absolutely. Folks, tune in next week while Christopher and I start our own cult on here.
So, it's interesting. So almost on that topic, it's funny to think that Victorian spirituality in a lot of ways really did carry over into the 20th century, not unbroken, but it kind of burst onto the scene again. Maybe what was it, maybe 20 years ago, but it's not significantly different when we saw what was once the almost pantomime like the seances and the ghost hunting and everything that was a very big part of Victorian spirituality basically become the modern ghost hunting tradition. And although obviously they weren't the first paranormal group out there, but when ghost hunters began, which was it must have begun in the early 2000s, I suppose. I'm not even sure exactly when the show began itself, but it was the first major televised ghost hunting or paranormal hunting show, and in almost every important aspect it was no different than a classic Victorian ghost hunt. And please forgive me, anybody out there for saying this, but including all the bells and whistles and all of the anytime a person is I'm shining a flashlight around in a black room where nothing's happening and saying, ooh, what was that, ooh, what was that, and you don't hear it, well, it strikes me that chances are, if nobody's hearing it or nobody's seeing it, maybe it's not actually happening, entertaining, but it was effective, and
It
it
was.
led us to believe that all these things were happening. So, with all forgiveness to a lot of the televised ghost hunting groups, I don't blame you. If somebody offered me enough money, I would probably put on a show for them as well. But even still, a lot of it was smoke and mirrors, and and these folks are basically just reliving the Victorian spiritualism of the past with a little bit higher tech.
Sure. And I think I'm glad you brought that up, because without these ghost hunter shows, we would probably, well, we probably wouldn't be having this show, to tell you the truth,
Agreed.
because
Yeah, no,
we,
100%. We do owe
yeah,
sort of quite a lot.
we do.
2004 Facebook user, whoever you are out there. By the way, if you want to drop us your name so we know who you are, I'm afraid you're not showing up on screen there. But thank you for that little tidbit. We always like to see that.
Yes. Facebook user may be a ghost. Have we ever thought about that?
Well, that is entirely possible.
That's very possible.
Entirely
Yes.
possible. So I've always assumed that the dead tuned into our show, because who else would?
That's the other point that I want to make, though, about the ghost shows is it also informed our knowledge that only ghosts can be captured or witnessed at night.
Yes. Well, but that's an interesting thing. And let's, to give them a little credit. Now, it's true that you don't have to turn the lights off in order to hunt a ghost. And certainly you don't have to, it doesn't have to be nighttime. But I do understand that, because I was just having this conversation with a friend the other day, who didn't really understand, the paranormal events and things that I do. And we were talking a little bit about it. And, he said, I've been to all these places that are supposedly haunted. He was actually a manager at the Stanley Hotel for a while. And he said, all these famously haunted places, and I've never seen a ghost and everything. And I said, listen, the truth is, and I said, and I don't mean to say that anybody is more special than another, but it's certain people are attuned to certain things, and this is the way it is. But part of it is that if you're trying to see it, you're opening up whatever centers there are in the brain that can potentially see this kind of thing. And the best way I've always described this for years and years and years is very simple: that if you took a piece of software that was designed for a Windows computer and tried to install it into a Mac, you can't do it. You can install it. You could plug a flash drive into it, whatever you need to do, but it's not going to work because the two systems are incompatible. But if you put it into the proper machine and they're compatible, now you've got a whole different thing. You've got a whatever Photoshop, whatever program that you're using. But does that mean that to the computer that can't see it, it still exists? They're simply not capable of recognizing it. And I know that sounds like a really dopey explanation, but the truth is that that's, I think, very much what happens when you have any kind of paranormal, or supernatural force that is perceived by some and not perceived by others. Obviously, in some cases, they're hoaxes or misunderstandings or simply a misinterpretation of natural phenomena. But when a real paranormal thing, an entity, a ghost or what have you, manifests and one person can experience it, another person can't, it very much, I believe, is individual ability to perceive these things and where your mind sort of rests and all that. If one person is excellent at math and one person can't add 2 and 2, it's because they have different skill sets. I don't see any reason why perception would be different than that.
Good point.
So I want to talk a little bit, since we're talking about now, we've gotten out of the theory of ghosts and we're talking a little about what really is out there, that there are certain kind of classifications of ghosts that have come up over the years. And none of this is meant to be set in stone, because we don't understand enough yet about what is a ghost to be able to, codify them like as if I was like an entomologist, something like that. But we have ways to sort of classify ghosts at least into basic categories. And one of them, probably the one that we're all most familiar with, would be what we simply refer to as the classic ghost. Now, the classic ghosts are intelligent and interactive. They're the most common ghosts in fiction and literature because they often have will and desires. They can be good-hearted or wicked. And in fiction and literature, most often, this is how you see ghosts portrayed, whether that's Casper the Friendly Ghost, whether that's Peter Quint from the Turn of the Screw. These are ghosts that are like invisible versions of real living people with all of their original desires, all of their original intentions. But I would have to say, and I'd be happy to know if you agree with me on this, that while that is the most common fictional form of ghost, I think it is the least common kind of ghost that people ever actually experience. I feel that most actual ghostly phenomena doesn't have that full interactivity, that sense of will, and I believe it is a very rare occurrence to see that in the actual world.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. For all the ghost encounters I've ever investigated, or walking through and doing tours of various haunted locations, very rarely does anyone ever stumble into what would be called a classic or an intelligent haunting. It's always going to be, almost always going to be, the residual haunting, which I'm sure you have a slide for. Yes.
Now, the funny thing about residual hauntings, though, all right, so let me ask, this is just a little pop quiz here. Has anybody ever answered the phone and gotten an auto call that convinced you for a few moments that it was a real person because it was responsive and it got all your questions right until you suddenly realized that it wasn't a real person? It's happened to me because these robocalls are getting better and better and better. And this is true, I believe, also of what we would call a residual haunting. A residual haunting is a haunting that is essentially it's an automaton. These ghosts return to the places they knew. They usually repeat an action or an event from their life. But in a way, a residual haunting can be almost like an artificial intelligence. It has just enough leftover, just enough residual identity from whatever or whoever it was in life that it can still respond to certain kinds of stimulus. And so these, I think, can be easily confused for a classic ghost and intelligent haunting because they can respond to stimulus, they can even potentially answer simple questions, but even still they're doing it from a limited bank. Again, it's just like a robocall that happens to be programmed to know certain words. And so I think that does happen periodically, but most of them just go through the motions of whatever they did in their own lives.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. But that is a good point because there are always those variables out there whenever people stumble upon a supposed residual haunting, and then suddenly the apparition notices that there's somebody there, right? So it's stepping beyond that monotony of a past activity and actually recognizing that there's something more going on here. Outside of what their actions are, and those can be kind of terrifying. I've dealt with those, never personally, but I've investigated those things before, where people would see somebody climbing their step repeatedly the same time every night, and then one time they just simply try to go there to see what's going on, and as this mist, whatever is coming down the stairs, it doesn't continue its daily trek or its nightly trek. It stops because all of a sudden it understands that there's something different about the environment.
Yeah, and I think that can be triggered, by the right
Yes, oh, sure.
circumstance, where, whether it's the person that it encounters in some way reminds them of somebody that existed in their life and therefore causes them to kind of go off track that way, or the right conditions are present. But no, I think that does happen. And it's interesting because most, just to kind of backpedal for a minute here, most episodes we have done here on Monday Night Monsters, we've kind of eschewed for the most part the idea of talking openly about the actual supernatural. We've stuck mostly within the history of these things, but both Ron and I have experienced some very unique things in our lives, and I think we are both what I would call believing skeptics, where we have belief that these things exist on some level, but try to be skeptical and scientific about the way we approach them. And so it is interesting because this is, I think, one of the first times we're really directly talking about the actuality of a paranormal or supernatural event. I'm sorry, I'm an old man. I still think of supernatural. Paranormal still seems so modern to me, but I have experienced one very, very defining moment in my life with what I believe was a residual haunting, and that was what got me started on this path when I was only 16. And I don't want to give a detailed account of it because we only have about 12 minutes left in our show tonight, but I experienced the spirit of what appeared to be a young woman, and which I believe, based on what happened to me that night, that she may have either taken her own life or died under very tragic circumstances. And it was an immensely affecting, moment in my life, and I think in a lot of ways set me on the path that I'm on to this day. So I am an absolute believer that these things exist. I just believe they're more rare by far than most of these ghost hunting shows would lead you to believe. And I think that if in fact that hauntings and these supernatural paranormal phenomena were as common as your average day-to-day ghost hunting group or ghost hunting show would lead you to believe that we'd have definitive documented evidence, and it would be a scientific reality. Now I think there's so much of it where we stretch our belief because we want it to be true, so we take evidence that doesn't really have a lot of scientific weight to it and consider it to be solid evidence.
I agree 100%. If it was as common as we're led to believe, then we would have scientific measurements of these things. We would have some notion what happens with the energy of a human body after the physicality of the person becomes deceased, without a doubt. So right now, when we talk about the world of ghosts, there is still a belief there has to still be all that quasi-religious faith going on there, that there is something out there. Because look, I have investigated hundreds of so-called hauntings, and really none of the ones that I've ever responded to gave me any kind of definitive evidence that there was something out there. Anecdotal things, sure, some lights going off, maybe a weird sound on a voice recorder, but nothing definitive to tell me that this was indeed a haunting by some sort of spirit.
And for me, that's actually really valuable, because the way I look at it is that if there were 999, or if there were 1,000 reports of ghost activity and 999 of them all turned out to be hoaxes and only one of them turned out to be true, that one true one proves everything.
Absolutely.
And that's why, to me, I do want to sweep away the nonsense stories, to sweep away the hype and the bogus stories and the hoaxes and the ones where people just convince themselves of it. Because by sweeping those away, like Sherlock Holmes or Arthur Conan Doyle said, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, is the truth. And I think that that's in ghost hunting. I think that's a very important thing that we forget sometimes, is that if you assume that everything is true, you end up having nothing that's true. And I think that that's unfortunate.
This is the reason why I like to be your partner on this podcast.
Because we're both grumpy old skeptics.
Exactly.
So speaking of being skeptical, something I have never witnessed, and I don't know that I ever will, because I imagine that it has to be extraordinarily rare, even though it's been reported quite a lot, is the next classification of ghost, the poltergeist. Now, I have never witnessed poltergeist activity. If you have, that's extraordinary, and I certainly am jealous of you. But poltergeist activity, of course, is physically active and often destructive. They can toss and break things, move objects around, and sometimes even attack people, causing scratches, wounds, welts, and things like that. Although, for what it's worth, I don't believe that there is any documented case in all of history of a person ever being actually killed by a ghost. And so I would imagine that these noisy ghosts, these poltergeists, are not quite as dangerous as people sometimes chalk them up to be. But poltergeist activity is fascinating because, of course, as I know you suggested this when we were discussing this before we got started, is often thought to be associated not necessarily with an actual ghost or spirit, but psychic turmoil, possibly related to adolescent children, and I think more common even with adolescent girls. Although I don't know, how detailed the research is on that. It might just all come from the movie Poltergeist, for all I know. But even still, I've heard that theory very commonly passed around.
Right. Well, we have the Enfield haunting too over in England. That was girls as well too. Probably fake, but yeah, the idea that there's some sort of catalyst there, let us talk about, usually involves somebody that's going into puberty. I'm sure a female going into puberty. But in many ways, I will tell you that I think the movie, like the Blair Witch Project, is much more poltergeist than it is haunting, because you really don't see anything. There's a tormenting going on and stuff. And I think that then if we would look at this, the Bell Witch as well too, the one that happened.
Fascinating story, yeah.
Yeah. And that may have driven somebody to their death or been responsible for the death. But again, it's this incessant otherworldly involvement in somebody's life, calling out your name, knocking at something, keeping you up to all hours, to the point that you gradually start going insane.
Correct. Yeah. So that actually dovetails very nicely into the last classification that I wanted to tackle tonight, which isn't necessarily even a ghost, precisely speaking, but is often sort of lumped in with other hauntings, and that is the idea of a demonic infestation of some kind, basically possession, the presence of an inhuman or demonic force which displays poltergeist-like activity, combined with noxious smells, disturbing voices, and often overly malevolent intentions, frequently connected with religious belief. They often drop names that are, from usually old ceremonial magic about demonic names like Beelzebub, Astaroth, things like that. But this demonic idea, and that is something that has grown by leaps and bounds over the last decade or so in paranormal investigation. And I got to tell you, that is the one where I hit a brick wall. And I think that most cases of alleged demonic infestation are either wildly misinterpreted or are hoaxes, because that's one that just doesn't hold water with most of when you actually apply any kind of a standard of research to it, it just doesn't hold up.
Right. And that is the buzzword on the television shows nowadays, getting back,
really
going almost full circle now. The idea the first time we ever watched Ghost Hunters on television was interesting because we never saw this before, right?
Correct.
And then everybody and their brother had a show and everybody was doing it. So in order to stay current in a way, you have to start developing other things, right? So now everything is demons. It makes for great television, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah, exactly. And you invariably have a host that is on the expedition and becomes demonically possessed at least one time a week, which I would think would do some sort of internal damage to you after that. But
Gotta go and do an MRI on that one.
That's exactly. But the idea that this is a demon haunted world is very concurrent, I think, also by what's going on in the world. It's very uneasy out there right now. The world is in turmoil. There is, as Worldwide Ghost said, this kind of archaic energy out there as well. And I think that blends in quite well with what's going on in the paranormal world as well. There's a lot of uncertainty out there, and I think the best way to see, or the best way to kind of describe what's going on in the world, is simply attribute it to demonic forces.
Yeah. So I want to quickly jump into, I know we haven't done too many of the comments tonight without Ken behind but a couple of folks, Mary Beth, you were saying that you believe in demons and don't want to meet one. And I certainly 100% agree with you on that one. Self-manifested negative energy that takes on a life of its own. And these are all things that are very, very, the idea of the manifested energy certainly is a very reasonable theory. There's a concept that I believe actually comes from Eastern philosophy of something called a tulpa. And a tulpa is an entity, like a ghost-like entity, but that's actually created from the energy of people. Basically, that if enough people collectively believe in something, that it can actually give birth to an entity of some kind. And as for demons themselves, part of this is because I believe that it's so easy to associate these demonic forces with something that is distinctly religious. The very concept of demons, basically the word demon being an anglicized version of a much older term that doesn't really mean the same thing, but the demon word itself means something intrinsically evil, and something that's evil comes from a religious dichotomy. And so that's one of the reasons that I can find it more difficult to swallow. What I don't find impossible to believe in is predatory beings or entities that may exist in some other plane of existence and that could actually cause us harm or prey on us in some way, whether it's taking our energy or what have you. And so I do believe that these things can exist. What I don't really believe is that this constant onslaught of demonic activity seen in the paranormal field right now is likely to be genuine, especially if you consider the fact that, once again, all of these people claiming to be assaulted by this demonic activity on a day-to-day basis are all coming back unscathed. And they say, oh yeah, I had these terrible scratches on the back of my neck. Well, they couldn't have been all that bad because you don't have any scars left over from them. So this idea that they tend to pump the idea of demons up as this truly dreadful thing, akin to what we'd see in The Exorcist, but the outcome on the far side, the next morning they're at IHOP having breakfast and they're none worse for wear. So it does make it difficult for me to believe in those reports, not necessarily in the existence of something demonic, but in the reports that have become so widespread in the paranormal field. And I think that exactly what you said, Ron, I think that demons are sexier in a way than just plain old ghosts, and ghosts have become so commonplace that it's just a way to drive the ratings. And I hate to say that, but it does strike me that that's the way things have gone.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing before we wrap up the show. I do a lot of ghost tours and a lot of talks at one rather iconic haunted location, and for years since the opening of this particular site, it was believed there was a child that was haunting this room, and as of recently, within the last 6 months, that child ghost, who had a backstory and everything, has now become a demonic presence within the place that was masquerading as a child. And I should say that corresponds nicely with the rise in how much people are now paying to get into that location.
Yeah, unfortunate, but true.
It is.
So, guys, we are right on the 9 o'clock hour here, and there were a couple of things that we had wanted to talk about we didn't get to tonight, but we got through all the big stuff and everything. So I think we did all right this evening. But before we go, I want to just wish all you guys a wonderful, happy Halloween, and let you know that, again, just a reminder that next Monday we will not be live, but we are working right now on putting together a pre-recorded show with a real fun Halloween treat to put out there for you. So, guys, still tune back in next week for Monday Night Monsters. And while we won't be answering your questions, hopefully we'll have a real fun program for you. Ron, as always, great to see you. Mary Beth, Jeff, Pepper, all of you folks out there, so good to have you guys with us again. And we will see you in 1 week for a very special Halloween pre-recorded episode of Monday Night Monsters. Good night, guys.
Trick or treat.